After the two Versus series were complete, Capcom went silent on future iterations for the Street Fighter franchise. Instead, Capcom decided to continue extending the franchise's characters into other games and other genres. For their next big crossover fighting game, Capcom decided not to focus on licensed properties but instead on its own franchises. Not only that, but it would be Capcom's second attempt at translating a typically 2D fighting game series into 3D with polygonal graphics. The game was titled Capcom Fighting All-Stars and would feature characters from Street Fighter, Final Fight, Rival Schools, and Strider. Along with the returning characters, new characters were created for the game as well. Capcom ran a limited beta test for the game in arcades, but after a lot of negative feedback from players, the game was later cancelled. What was left of Capcom Fighting All-Stars was salvaged into a new 2D fighting game titled Capcom Fighting Jam, or Capcom Fighting Evolution in North America. The premise for the game was a mashup of Capcom's biggest franchises that focused on each of their specialties. The game's roster consisted of characters from Street Fighter II, Street Fighter Alpha, Street Fighter III, Darkstalkers, and Red Earth. Depending on which series the character originated from, the player would have a different fighting system available to them. The only new character was Ingrid, who originated from Capcom Fighting All-Stars. Her fighting system was based on that game's original system. The game was released in arcades in 2004 and ported to the PlayStation 2 and Xbox. Capcom Fighting Evolution was met with numerous bad reviews upon its release. Other than Ingrid, all the other characters felt like they were merely ripped from their respective fighting games but not given the proper adjustments to fit in the game. This resulted in all kinds of play balance issues, recycled graphics, sound, and mechanics. Since it was immediately compared to Capcom's other Versus games, the game's roster was incredibly underwhelming, featuring only a handful of characters from each franchise, totaling only 24 characters. So it was more than likely that many of the fan favorites weren't available at all. Midway through the game's production, the game's producer Yoshiki Okamoto decided to leave the project and was replaced by a longtime music and sound designer named Yoshinori Ono. So when Capcom Fighting Evolution became universally panned by critics and seen as a failure to Capcom, the blame was placed on Yoshinori Ono, who admitted that the crossover of the mechanics and gameplay systems from each series resulted in the game's balance issues. Despite the failure of Capcom Fighting Evolution, Capcom continued to extend their Street Fighter franchise into other video games. Those hoping for a sequel to the popular Marvel vs. Capcom 2 were disappointed to learn that after Capcom's contract with Marvel Comics expired, Marvel partnered with Electronic Arts to produce a new fighting game titled Marvel Nemesis: Rise of the Imperfects. So Capcom looked into another Japanese game company to combine their franchise characters with, and they found it with Namco. In January 2005, Namco announced that they would be partnering with Capcom in publishing Namco X Capcom for the PlayStation 2. The game was a hybrid of an action and strategy RPG. It was developed by Monolith Soft, best known at the time for the RPG series Xenosaga and Baten Kaitos. The story of the game focused on two main protagonists and an original story that was filled with cameos from Namco and Capcom franchises. Even though the game was more of an RPG, the battle screen had controls similar to that of a fighting game. Not only that, but many of the characters had the same signature moves from their original games. While Namco X Capcom wasn't a fighting game like Capcom's other crossovers, the game developed quite a following from fans that enjoyed the idea of two Japanese video game companies coming together into one dream game. The game was fun, easy to play, and paid homage to the numerous franchises on display. The question of whether Namco X Capcom would appeal to fans outside Japan eventually became a concern. It was likely that the game wouldn't interest anyone who wasn't familiar with the numerous characters from Namco's and Capcom's classic franchises. Most of its appeal would likely be only meant for older Japanese gamers who grew up with these characters. Because of these concerns, along with the heavy amount of localization required for the large volume of text and voice acting in the game, Namco X Capcom was never released outside of Japan. For a while, the only way fans outside Japan could hope to play the game was by importing it. However, a group of video game fans at Transgen got together to work on an English translation for the game. Their work resulted in an English patch that could be applied to an ISO or disk image of the game, which could then be played on a modded PS2 or a PS2 emulator on the PC. For fans of Street Fighter and its crossover fighting games, there was the freeware 2D fighting game engine known as M.U.G.E.N. Designed by Electbyte, the engine was originally intended to be used for developing fighting games for the MS-DOS back in 1999. The engine allowed for up to 7 gameplay buttons, directional keys, 2 human players, enemy AI, and several options for gameplay modes. Development was switched to the Linux platform in 2001 and ultimately ceased in 2003 while a Windows version was being made. When the beta version leaked, the engine was hacked by a third party to allow anyone to create characters, background stages, and other game objects such as text, graphics, and sound. This allowed people to hack the engine even further to include characters from many existing fighting games along with many of its assets. Many fans have gone even further to design their own characters from scratch, including numerous versions of popular Street Fighter characters. The engine is now widely regarded as a heavily customizable game that allows anyone to design their own fighting game with a multitude of options to make it just the way they want it. By 2008, fans had faced a long wait for another new Capcom crossover fighting game, let alone a new Street Fighter game. Capcom finally answered with the announcement of their 7th crossover fighting game. This time, Capcom would be partnering with the Japanese animation studio Tatsunoko Production. Founded in 1962, Tatsunoko Production has worked on many Japanese television programs for decades, some of which have brought them worldwide acclaim. And today, several of Japan's top animation studios have their roots in Tatsunoko. The game would be published by Capcom and developed by Aiding, a Japanese developer known for making 3D anime fighting games. It was first released in Japan in the arcades on December 2008, entitled Tatsunoko vs. Capcom Cross Generation of Heroes. The game system borrowed many elements from the Marvel vs. Capcom series with a few unique changes of its own. The button configuration was reduced to just 3 attack buttons and an assist button. Players could select 2 characters for a tag team or just one of the 2 larger characters. The game's roster consisted of characters from Tatsunoko and Capcom properties that were chosen by the development team as their own desirable lineup in a fighting game. The Capcom side consisted of Ryu, Chun-Li, and Alex from the Street Fighter series, Morrigan from Darkstalkers, Batsu from Rival Schools, Soki from Onimusha Dawn of Dreams, Mega Man, Roll, Beautiful Joe, and the PTX-40A from Lost Planet. The Tatsunoko side consisted of franchises that spanned the company's long-time history. These included Ken the Eagle, Kashan, Tekkaman, Yataman 1, Polymar, Joronjo, Keras, June the Swan, Ipatsuman, and the Golden Warrior Laitan. The final boss of the game was Yami, the demon from Okami, who had to be defeated in 3 forms. When the game was ported to the Nintendo Wii, it added 2 new characters, Hakushon Daimo from the Genie family and Saki Omokane from Capcom's Quiz Nanaido Dreams. Along with the traditional fighting game modes, it also added character-specific minigames that extended its multiplayer options. Initially, it was believed that Tatsunoko vs. Capcom would remain exclusive for the Japanese market. This was primarily due to the licensing issues regarding Tatsunoko's properties. While Tatsunoko owned all the rights to their properties in Japan, when it came to other regions, the properties for most of the game's cast were currently licensed by many different companies. The fact that most of Tatsunoko's lineup would appear obscure to many gamers outside Japan also became a problem. Fortunately, in 2009, Capcom announced that Tatsunoko vs. Capcom would soon be seeing a release in North America and Europe as Tatsunoko vs. Capcom Ultimate All-Stars. In addition to localizing the game, Capcom is planning to make it the definitive version of the game by adding new features, new characters, and online multiplayer. In 2004, after the failure of Capcom Fighting Evolution and multiple attempts at revitalizing the fighting game genre, Noritaka Funamizu and Yoshiki Okamoto, the last members of the original Street Fighter II team still at Capcom, decided to move on from the company after having been there for 17 years. Funamizu started the video game company Craft & Meister, where he would develop games like Super Dragon Ball Z, and Okamoto founded the company Game Republic, where he would develop games like the Genji series and Folklore. After facing ongoing criticism for recycling their characters in fighting games and diminishing returns on new iterations, Capcom decided to shut down their 2D fighting game department. Not only did these events mark the end of the Street Fighter franchise for many fans, but also the end of an era that had generated many of Capcom's greatest video games. Though the series' legacy appeared to have ended, the fanbase which it had garnered would continue to grow. Over the years, many fans have developed communities that would continue to gather and play their favorite fighting games together in competitive tournaments. One of the largest and longest running of these fighting game tournaments is the Evolution Championship Series, which brings together some of the greatest fighting game players from around the world. Many of their best players have even managed to rise up to a sort of celebrity status among fellow gamers. After more than a decade, despite all the criticisms they may have received in the past, the Versus fighting games are not only considered the best spin-offs of the Street Fighter franchise, but also the best in the genre. They are an essential part of why Capcom reigned as the leading name when it came to great fighting games. Their popularity still continues to exceed Capcom's expectations as gamers still continue to play them and create some of the most memorable moments in video game history. Next time, in Part 7 of this Street Fighter Retrospective, the influence of Street Fighter expands beyond the medium of video games. The Street Fighter universe would continue to expand through fiction created from films and television, and interpretations by its countless fans around the world.
Tá sim?